Hello, and welcome to Sailing and Cruising the East Coast of the United States podcast. I'm Bela Musits.
And I'm Mike Wasserman.
Hey, Mike, today's guests on the podcast are Sawyer and Simon Balint. They've been on the podcast several times before, and last summer they crossed the Atlantic Ocean, leaving from Newport, Rhode Island, and ending up in the UK. In this conversation with them, we talk about the changes they made to their boat to improve its ability to sail in a broader range of wind angles and wind speed, and also to improve some safety elements.
Yeah. Now, Bela, I love these updates from Sawyer and Simon. And listeners, if you're longtime listeners, you'll know these guys, and this will be a great update. And if you're a new listener and you haven't checked out some of the earlier episodes with them, go for it. So, okay, get your pencils out. And they've been on episodes 29 was the first time we had them, 84 and 85, 89, 88 and 89, and most recently in 92 and 93. So this will be great on its own, but listeners, you might want to go listen to the earlier ones if you haven't yet. So this is going to be a tour de force of information about sails and all the various contextual factors relating to what really starts as a basic triangle of fabric that every boat starts with, right? In the smallest sunfish. And then, as you'll see, it can quickly become more and more nuanced in terms of technology and the choices you can make about your sails. It was really a little overwhelming, even for for me, Bela.
Oh, well, I found it very interesting, and I think sailors certainly will find it interesting, and non-sailors or beginners will find it very educational and informative. And I always enjoy talking to Sawyer and Simon. So let's get right into the interview with them.
Sounds good.
3, 2, 1. Sawyer, Simon, great to see you again on the podcast.
Hi, Bela. Hey, Bela. How are you?
Well, thank you very much. Hey, just got back from the boat. We were there Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. It rained every day, all day long, except Sunday afternoon.
Sounds about right.
So it was not a great visit, although we were there to see the new granddaughter. So, we didn't spend that much time on the boat.
Awesome. You got down a lot this year, I think.
We did.
Great.
Yeah. It was a good season. Good season. So you guys sailed across the Atlantic last summer, and you've been on the podcast. I think this is your 5th time at least. So in episodes 88, 89, 93, and 94, we talked about kind of getting ready to sail across the Atlantic and then sailing across the Atlantic, basically leaving from Newport all the way to the UK, making a couple of stops along the way. And in this podcast, I thought I'd like to talk about is sort of what you did. We talked about preparing the boat in a previous episode, but I really want to dive into sort of what you did from a perspective of your sail plan, right? Because that's what moves the boat. So you have to have good sails. Yeah. And sailing around the bay is one thing, and if my sail jams, it's no big deal. But if you're in the middle of Atlantic and something not so nice happens because you have an equipment failure, it's a bigger deal. So sort of talk about what you guys did from a sail plan perspective, and the capabilities you added to the boat for that. So not only to make the boat sail faster, more comfortable, and better, but also safer. So that's sort of what I had in mind.
Yeah, cool.
So I'll let you guys sort of start. Pick one and go from there.
All right. I mean, the only thing I'll say to start, and then probably let Sawyer get into it, because really it's been an evolution for us from 6 years ago when we first bought the boat till the whole setup we had crossing the Atlantic. And so I think we might be able to share some things too that do work in the bay, because we're much better sailors now. We're up and down Narragansett Bay. In part because the way we've modified the boat from a sail plan perspective, and that doesn't just include getting new sails. It means equipment that can make your sails work better. So we've really, I mean, this is a podcast about sailing, right? So sails are important. So we do have a lot to talk about, I think. But why don't you start, Sawyer?
Sure. Well, I mean, when we bought the boat, it had a pretty minimal sail plan, I'd say, right? It had a main and a jib. So Had a full batten mainsail and 125% Genoa. Pretty common setup for a sloop. And I think early on, those first couple of years, we found that we could sail upwind, we could sail on a beam reach, a broad reach. It was kind of 90 degrees on either side, right? 45 to 145 on either direction, 135. But obviously you can't sail straight upwind, and nothing we can do is going to change that. And we also couldn't sail straight downwind. And for coastal sailing, I think that works fine, right? Like when it's nice weather, we sail, and if it's not the right direction, then we motor. But we ended up having more and more experiences where we wish we could expand that range. And I remember vividly trying to sail downwind to, I think we were coming back from Block Island. And
yeah, exactly.
You remember that? And it was light wind. We're trying to sail down, and we're coming into Narragansett Bay, and we had kind of a tide against current situation. I mean, nothing crazy, but like maybe a knot and a half of current coming out of Narragansett Bay, and you get these kind of confused swells, and the boat's rolling back and forth, and the mainsail is just driving back and forth, bang, 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 and we look out on the deck, and we have these pieces of our plastic main sail track slides are just littered across the deck, and we look up and the main is flapping around the front. So that was kind of our first indication that we had to make some changes.
Yeah, and I remember thinking that too. So a sail from this, Bela, but other listeners may not. Like Block Island back up to the northern part of Narragansett Bay, this beautiful sail, and it's about 4 or 5 hours if everything's going right, and the wind is often in Narragansett Bay blowing up or down the bay, which gives you great sailing and great racing opportunities, and that's why Narragansett Bay is so famous for racing. But in our case, yeah, the wind was directly behind us. We were trying to go back up the bay, but we couldn't go that way. It's really frustrating, right? So instead of going up the bay, which is 12 miles, we had to be jiving back and forth, and our sails breaking, all that stuff. So I remember that exactly. There's got to be a way to sail the way the wind's going, right?
Absolutely. I remember, actually that trip too. We pulled the vang out from the base of the mast, which ended up being a recurring issue of ours. And again, this is all in 5 knots of wind. So I would say there's kind of 2 big upgrades that sort of stem from that. The first one was in relation to jibe prevention, and then the second one was in relation to the rigidity of the main itself. And so in terms of jibe prevention, over the years, we've tried a couple of different methods. We started out with these, Bela, you might remember this from our early days sailing, these long lines that we would stretch from the end of the boom all the way up to the bow. And we had these little clips, and we kind of clip them on and off. And the idea is that we'd have this really robust way of preventing an unintentional jibe from happening. But the downside to that system is it's extremely clunky. Every time you change direction, you have to go up onto the mast and do this big rearrangement. And as with most things, if it's hard to do, you end up not doing it. Mm-hmm. So more often than not, we find ourselves not actually having any jibe preventer at all. And certainly on this day, when it was 5 knots of wind, you think, well, it doesn't really matter. But when the boom is going back and forth, you do want something to stop that from happening.
And just a quick, people probably do know this, but at least on our boat, if you can't sort of secure your main and you've got a risk of a jibe, as Sawyer said, you really can't get down above 130, at least in our boat. You get past that with a roll or a little shift in wind, you're really risking a nasty jibe. Right. So you have that there's a big part of the pie you can't be sailing in because you're kind of you're hedging your bets, so to speak. And so that some way of securing the main can let you start to get more downwind, and that opens up some opportunities. So that preventer was one idea.
Yeah, when the water's flat like it is on the bay, you can get to 170.
Yeah, you can push it, right? Because
right? You can push it because the boat's not moving around. But if you got a 6 or 7 foot swell and the boat's, going around and you're going downwind, so you're riding that swell, the boat's changing angle, changing the apparent wind angle
exactly
pretty severely.
Yep.
Could be by 20 degrees just because of where you're rolling on a wave, and that could be a challenge. So a lot of people who coastal sail or bay sail may not understand that concept as clearly as you guys do.
I'll also say too, it depends on how attentive you want to be. Right. So like if I'm dinghy racing, there are some situations where you might sail even by the lee, and you have a really thin margin of error for having unintentional jibe. But when you're racing, it's you're very focused. But when you're having your lunch and a glass of champagne, coming into Narragansett Bay, maybe you don't want to be, on a razor's edge,
right?
Trying to sail the downwind.
Yep. So there's a lot of discussion about preventer, or the other, method of keeping your main sort of secure is a boom brake. And you can talk to people who swear by the preventer, hate the boom brake, and vice versa. So we didn't really know. We I don't know why. We probably saw some YouTube video first about a preventer, so that's what we did. But we moved to a boom brake, and that is a fantastic piece of gear. Really inexpensive. I think in our case we bought one, probably almost never used, but a secondhand one online for less than $500, $300 maybe, sir. And it's like it completely changes the way you can sail. So maybe, explain how we set it up and how we use it.
Yeah, I mean, so I remember you were the one who installed it, actually. So you can speak to how easy or difficult it was. My recollection is it was quite easy.
If I did,
essentially, but essentially what it is just a, you have a continuous line, or you have a line running kind of about midships, and it goes from, the deck right by the gunnel, I guess, up to the boom and then back down. So it makes a little triangle. And where it interacts with the boom is where the boom brake is actually housed. And it's essentially the idea of a winch. I mean, you have the line in some form or fashion, it wraps around a piece of metal a few times. And when pressure is applied to the line, it creates friction. And so there's different styles out there, but they all operate on that basic idea. It's not hard to move the line through when you don't have any force on it, but as the force increases, there's more and more friction. So it tends to kind of reach an equilibrium. And we can just leave it on there all the time. And so, if we're tacking, the boom will come across, generally just fine. It adds a little bit of friction, but nothing too crazy. And then if we're sailing downwind and there's, more force on the main, we have it running back to the cockpit, and we can add tension to that line, which then increases the friction. And so we have that ability to adjust and get the level of friction that we want. And it makes driving almost as easy as tacking. There's no drama. There's no big slam when it reaches the end of the main sheet. It's a very controlled endeavor.
So before this, and maybe I'm not sure, Bela, your boat, maybe some of the other listeners, have this experience. If you're going to jibe, we had to bring our main back to center and then jibe.
Yep.
Basically. And as Sawyer mentioned, everything you have to do kind of encourages you not to do anything. At least, it's like, oh, that's kind of a pain, I'm not going to do it. So you wait longer. But with the boom brake, and Sawyer mentioned, it comes back to the cockpit. You can put it on a winch, so you can control how much tension you want. But based on the wind and the sea state, we could kind of tune it in where, the main would just come back and forth nice and easy. And that means you just, almost like tacking, you just jibe. Really piece of cake. Also means, though, that you can have your main all the way out. If you want to really kind of push that 180 downwind, it can be all the way out, and you can really crank it. And it's not going to want to move on you. And that's great for that downwind sailing. And later on, as we experience crossing the Atlantic, it's really good for safety, because if you get up on deck, one of the most dangerous things, of course, in crossing is falling off the boat. Right? Don't fall off the boat. How do you fall off the boat? mostly because a boom whacks you off the boat, right? So if we had to get up on deck for some sort of repair and the conditions were kind of rough, you know, you could, I guess, take the main down, you know, but that's also a lot of work. Instead, we could just crank down on that boom brake, kind of lock our main in place, and then go do the work we wanted to. Still being cautious, but you know, pretty secure that we're not going to get whacked.
Yeah, very good. Very good.
So
So that sounds like a really good tip. What else did you guys do? I mean, you mentioned coming back from Block Island, not only was your boom slapping back and forth, but also it sounded like the sail was coming unattached from the mast.
Yeah, that led to the installation of our fast track system, which Simon, I'll let you take the lead on.
Yeah. Okay. So that was you know, in our mainsail when we got it, and maybe it's pretty typical. It has I think they're called slides or slugs, right? They go up and down the mast. I know, Bale, you got that fancy, you know, furling system, but
Right.
you know, the rest of us here have to deal with an old-fashioned main. So those are they're slugs, and they're plastic of some sort. I don't know if they're nylon or what they are, but they're some sort of composite. Yeah, they would break, number one. And two is we didn't realize this, but they're really hard. With a lot of friction there, and it's really hard to like lift and lower the main because those things get kind of worn out and they get stuck and whatnot. So to solve actually kind of a couple of those problems, we installed what was called a fast track, and I think different manufacturers call it different things. This was Tides Marine. Sawyer, is that the manufacturer?
Yeah, I can't remember.
Yeah, one of the main manufacturers, and basically you kind of install a track on a track. So instead of your track, which is built into your aluminum mast, ours was, you put this new track in that, and that new track has a track, and that track is designed to be a lot less, have a lot less friction, and then there are stainless slides that go in there, and it made for us, made raising and lowering the main so easy. If we did it properly and we were like headed into the wind where there wasn't a lot of force on the main, in the old days, we could get the main maybe half up by hand and the rest you had to crank. And Sawyer and I would kind of have a little competition on a good day or a good moment. We could get the main all the way up with no winch, right? That's kind of cool. And then lowering it, which is also really important, just, you release it from the winch and it just drops. Again, going back to like, if it's difficult to do, you don't do it. And Bill, you remember like the first trip we made from Fort Lauderdale? Like, I don't know, our first 5-day venture or whatever. I don't even think we used the main because we were like, we used the engine.
Right.
And we used the jib. That's about as far as we got, right? Because like, who wants to go on deck? And what happens if like we jibe accidentally or blah, blah, blah. So that fast track is, well, we installed like in a day, right? Sorry, we had them boom that mast down to do it.
Yeah. No, that was incredibly easy. And the track itself, I think we slid in there in about 10 minutes.
Yeah.
It's
like a big long piece of whatever plastic, right? And you fit it, and you just slide it up.
Yeah, it comes in a big roll.
Yeah. And then and then in terms of it comes with a whole bunch of slugs, and then I changed them out on the mainsail. Yeah, from plastic to the steel, and obviously we haven't broken any steel ones yet. So there's no way we would have gone across the Atlantic without having gone through, like a Costco size jug of plastic slides, right? Because
that's absolutely right. One other thing that just came to mind as thinking about that is, we, I think, got very used to having to come into the wind to make changes to our main. Right. So if we want to raise the main or lower the main, you have to be head to wind. And I think that's a pretty common mentality, especially coastal sailing. And that's easy enough to do when you're, in Narragansett Bay or somewhere and it's calm and it's not that wavy. And, to be fair, like it's still what we prefer to do. Like if we're coming into a harbor and we want to have a nice, good flaked mainsail, we'll come into the wind. The problem with that is if you're out in the middle of the ocean and you need to reef, you're not going to be turning into, 12-foot waves. It just doesn't make any sense. And so you need to be able to get the main down, or at least get it partially down to reef it while going downwind. And, we can do it with the fast track. It's not, I'm not going to say it's like fun or easy, but you can do it. There was absolutely no way that we
Yeah.
would have been able to reef the main with our old system.
I remember, sorry, like several years ago when when we had spare time on the boat, which is a lot of time, which cruising around, or going up from Florida, right? So and I would kind of talk about, okay, if we cross the Atlantic, what are some of the risks we have, or what are some of the upgrades? And I remember, Sawyer, you mentioning like, we need to be able to drop the mainsail from any angle. Like that's really important.
Yeah.
Because when you want to drop it, it's probably not at the angle you want to be at, right?
Yeah.
And that's, so we kind of thought about how do we get to that point? Because early on we couldn't do that. Yeah, we had to like turn, try to drop it, it gets stuck, wrestle it down. And that's, again, you can do that, but that's not a great solution.
So one of the things that I started doing this summer, when the wind's blowing on the bay, if it's 20 knots and I want to bring my mainsail in, if you turn into the wind, it's just flapping back and forth like, the flag on the flagpole. It's just crazy. So what I've been doing is hoving to. So I hove to, everything calms right down. And, I release my boom enough that it's basically there's no pressure, very little pressure on the mainsail. And then I can just roll it right up. So that has worked very well for me in those high wind situations, because it's always been a challenge for me when it's blowing above 15, turning into the wind, and I'll motor in. So my apparent wind is even higher, right? And I got to be looking out for crab pots and, it's just a lot of stuff going on.
Sure.
So I've done that several times this year with good results.
Good. Okay. Yeah, I think it's really important. Again, you want to make things as easy as possible, so you make good choices, and you don't make choices because it's too hard. You avoid things that are too hard, right? Yeah,
I mean, getting ready to hove to, you got to make some maneuvers, right? You got to do something. But once I figured out what the right angles are for stuff for hoving to on my boat, boom, it's really nice.
Nice. Yeah, it's an aside, but we went out on your boat this summer, Bela. Man, it's a dream to sail. It's a really nice, easy boat to sail in a good way. It's really enjoyable.
Good thing it's easy.
But then I guess getting back to like downwind sailing, which is so nice to be able to downwind sail. It kind of changed my whole outlook on sailing, right? Because you want to go over here, you go there. That's great. So the big thing with that was the Whisker Pole.
Right?
Yeah. And that's your specialty. So why don't you talk about that one?
Sure. Well, I think kind of thinking through this, so we've made all these upgrades and adjustments to the main, and we sort of got the main to the point where we could sail dead down at 180 degrees. But if you're going dead down, and you try and fly the Genoa, it's just going to be slack behind the main, right? There's no way to maintain that pressure. And so then, there's this thought of, well, what kind of foresail can we use to go dead down? So when we bought the boat, it did come with a spinnaker, an asymmetrical spinnaker. And there have been a handful of times where I've flown it, maybe out of boredom more than anything else, in a sense of adventure. But it's not that convenient, I have to say. I know, racers like it, but it's a really narrow wind range that the ASIM works in, right? I mean, if it's anything less than 5 knots apparent, it's not really going to fly on its own. It's not going to hold its shape. And then if you get to above maybe 10 or 12 apparent, it starts to get kind of unwieldy. Ours has a sock, so I guess that makes it easier for deploying it and retrieving it. But we find that the sock gets jammed in anything more than a few knots of wind. So that adds like another layer of complexity. And as we've been saying, if it's hard to do, you're not going to do it. So yeah, I can't say that if we were going to spend more money on a sail, I don't think we'd buy a spinnaker, even though we have one.
Yeah, so I remember thinking about that. Like, because the spinnaker we had was, it's old, and maybe we should get a new spinnaker. They're not that expensive, so it's kind of an easier upgrade to get. But again, Sawyer and I were chatting about it, Yeah, again, Sawyer would always be the one that would kind of get the bug to like fly the spinnaker, right? And I'm like, I just don't. Why? What's the point? No. So we run down and get in the V berth and pull it out and get it all set up. But the irony of the spinnaker is because of the narrow range, right? It's like 5 or 6 or 7 knots apparent. So you think, okay, I could kind of fly it, and then it, either it drops down to 3, in which case it's worthless, or it goes up to like 11, in which case it's like really hairy. So basically it's going to do something, but it's not going to stay in that one little window. And so usually what happened was, Sarah get this idea. I would say, well, don't bother. I want to do it. You go down, rig it up, raise it up, and then 10 minutes later, pull it down and be discouraged and put it away. I'm like, I'm never doing that again.
Yeah, I don't know if I've ever flown the spinnaker for more than about half an hour.
At most, right? It's just hard, right? And it's a really narrow. I mean, again, it's great sail. People use it for racing, and maybe in different conditions, like in the trade winds or places where you have a pretty consistent light wind, it would work. But it's not a solution for us to do downwind sailing. So back to our solution, I guess, which is a common solution. But what do we do?
Yeah, so we ended up going the Whisker Pole route, and certainly not the first people to do that. But it's just a pole that pulls out the head sail usually to windward, or at least the opposite direction of the main, and that's been a real game changer. I mean, it really increases the amount of sail area that we can fly going downwind. So I think we got our Whisker Pole from Forest Bar. It's a telescoping aluminum pole, pretty run of the mill. They have different sizes, depending on the size of your boat, and ours is somewhere in the middle of that range. And then we got in terms of storing it, some people store their Whisker Poles on the deck. We opted for a track on the front of the mast, which we installed ourselves. And so, one end of the pole, when you order the pole, you order the specific fittings on either side of the pole. So one side of the pole has a car that goes up and down on its track, and the other side has the jaws to grab onto that jib sheet. And it's super easy to deploy. It took us a few tries to kind of get a good sense of the right settings to use. But it's been a game changer. I don't know if we could have crossed the Atlantic without it. And honestly, we still use it pretty frequently, even just cruising around on the bay.
Yeah, I mean, so it lets us do the wing on wing, and it means that we can sail down. And it's the thing, when you're sailing downwind, wing on wing, you don't need to have the wind directly 180 behind you. You now, because if your main is locked and your Genoa's on this Whisker Pole, it can be plus or minus 10, 15 either side, and it's not, the boat's still fine.
Yeah.
And it gets more than that. We start to think, okay, now let's maybe change our setup. But and so in the bay, especially near against the bay, we go up and down the bay, right where we want to go. It's great. And when we cross the Atlantic, we talked about this in our previous podcast, right? I'd say to the Azores, like 70% of the time, we just had our Whisker Pole out and our main out, wing on wing, and we were just flying.
Mm-hmm.
So,
it's actually a really great, even for a broad reach. So thinking back on our crossing, I think we spent a lot of time maybe at an apparent wind angle of 120 or 130 with that Genoa pulled out to windward. But it increases your sail area so much relative to if you were to sail in a traditional way. And I think we found that to us, it offered a lot of flexibility. So we could have, our full main and our full Genoa on the pole, and then we can reef the Genoa with the roller furler with the pole up there. So, that allowed us to go from a wind range of, maybe as low as like 6, 7, 8 knots apparent before we turn the motor on. That's our low end. And then we could go up to maybe 18-ish apparent, progressively furling in the Genoa before we had to actually get on deck. So that offered us a lot of flexibility in a way that like a spinnaker certainly would not have offered.
So you say that now. I have clear memories of it being like 22 to 25 for hours, and me going, I think it's time to reef, and you're like, no, no problem. We were definitely doing more than 18 before we reefed, but yeah, it's probably you should. But yeah, it's nice because the spinnaker, the whisker pole is a little bit to attach and take off the Genoa. It is easier because we have it on a track, but you can furl it just like you would normally furl your jib or your Genoa with it still attached. So that is nice. If you don't want to get up on deck, you can just furl it in and deal with it later. We did that a lot too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's not super pretty. I think it falls in the same category as reefing or dropping the main going downwind, right? You're not going to get like a beautiful roll or a beautiful flake. Where you're 2,000 miles from land, no one's going to see it.
Right.
And,
right. So one of the themes that's coming through here in our conversation is that in getting ready to sail across the ocean, you really thought about ways in which you can increase your apparent wind angle in which you could sail in. So you want as broad as possible wind angle that you can sail in, number one. And then number two, also the wind speed. So trying to broaden the range in which you can sail the boat from a wind speed perspective as well. And that seems like that was sort of the one of those two things were the driving force behind making these changes and additions to your boat.
For sure. And when we say like broaden the angle and the speed, not only can will the boat perform at that level, but it's safe to be there. Yeah. And that in the case of a crossing out in the ocean, we don't have to get on deck, which is of course the most dangerous thing. So we could basically, a lot of things could change before we had to get on deck. And that's good because you want to stay somewhere else, right? So, yeah. And I guess, because we didn't know very much, and we had the sails that came with the boat, as Sawyer mentioned, and so we did spend time thinking about, should we get new sails? Should we get different kinds of sails, different materials, and whatever. And we did do some of that before a crossing. We can talk about that, but most of our performance increase happened because of adjustments to how we use those sails, like the boom brake, the whisker pole, the fast track. Right? Those are taking our existing sails and just making them work better. So
yeah. Now, if I remember correctly, you also added a stay sail.
Yeah.
Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, I think that the motivation for the stay sail was largely redundancy. I think the inspiration for it came from we were trying to figure out what our storm jib setup was going to be, and the storm jib that came with the boat, which had of course never been used, is the type that wraps around the furled Genoa. And as we were playing with it and trying to figure out how we would get this thing up the furled Genoa in 35, 40 knots of wind and breaking seas, it seemed completely untenable. And so we were looking at what are the other options, and having a inner forestay that we could then deploy and use for a second set of sails made a lot of sense.
Yeah. So putting another forestay in there is a little complicated. You got to attach it to the mast, obviously, but you also got to attach it to deck. You got to make sure the deck is strong enough there, etc. So did you guys hire somebody or get some advice from a rigger or to help you kind of figure that stuff out?
Yeah, this is one where we didn't just watch a YouTube video and do it. So we actually contracted with a local rigger, and they're fantastic. If I think of all the contractors we work with, they're probably one of the best. Easy to work with, knowledgeable, and not that expensive. So we in preparation for our crossing, we wanted to change all of our standing rigging to begin with, because we didn't know how old it was, but it was at least as old as we had the boat, 6 years, and we didn't think the previous owner had changed it. And although it looks good from your eye, you don't know what you can't see, right, at the microscopic level of those little strands. So we decided, let's just change everything and make sure it's good, and we'll upgrade actually some of the stays to a higher gauge wire. So we wanted to contract someone for that. And again, the local company, so they were doing that. And then we said, hey, we are interested in this idea of adding a staysail, making it like a cutter rig for a couple of reasons. And what would that entail? So the interesting thing about that is that if you have a fixed new stay in the front, like people call it a Solon stay, or they call like a mini stay. I don't know, there's different names for it. But basically, another stay to make it a cutter rig, right? If that's a fixed stay, then you can't tack with your roller furler, Genoa, without rolling it up and then bringing it on the other side, right? Because you got this now thing in the way. That's kind of a pain in the neck. So another way to approach it is to have a removable stay. So it's one that would be basically back at the mast. Instead of being, you can do wire, but instead of doing wire, you can use Dyneema, which is really strong and it can be sized appropriately. And the Dyneema line can run from the mast inside your headstay to the bow, and then back to the mast through some cleats and blocks. And then at the mast, you typically have a winch, right, for your main, or maybe a couple winches. You can use that winch to get tension, and then you can fly some other sail, 90% if you want, or a storm jib, or any kind of variety of sails.
Yeah.
When you're not doing it, you just pull that stay. Basically, you release tension, you pull that stay all the way back to the mast, secure at the mast, and now you've got your furling jib that you can use. So that's the approach we took, and our riggers kind of helped figure out, okay, where should that be on the mast, and like you mentioned, Bela, is your deck strong enough? Where can you put it? They're actually able to attach it up near the anchor roller and not make any modifications in terms of reinforcement to the deck. But they did add some hardware up there, and then the right kind of line, and actually it was a fairly affordable upgrade.
Yeah. So the stay sail in this case is a hank-on sail. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So how does the Dyneema wear when you're under those conditions? Is that okay?
Yeah, I mean,
good.
They make special hanks just for that. So yeah, I'm sure it's not a great solution if you're using it every day. It'd probably wear out somewhat quickly. But for our use case as being kind of a secondary redundancy, only using it occasionally, Dyneema was the right tool for the job.
Yeah.
And then the last thing I'll say is, so that the Passport sometimes is shipped with a cutter rig, and so when we bought the boat, we actually had spare rollers and equipment for a potential cutter rig, and there's actually an attachment point on the mast where that could be. The problem with a proper cutter rig is the inner forestay is so far inwards that you need running backstays to prevent the mast from bending in the center. And if you have running backstays, that's, I think, a real pain in the butt, because they get in the way of the boom, and so it's a whole extra set of hardware that you're trying to manage, and it just didn't fit with how we were planning to use it, which was not very much.
Yeah.
I remember talking to the riggers about that, and this removable for inner forestay with Dyneema, and they made some other adjustments too. Remember, Sawyer, like the little telescoping arm for the spinnaker, so it could fly more properly. Mm-hmm. And they adjusted the where our forestay, our main forestay came out of the mast. Anyway, all of that was about a third of the price of what it would cost to put in a more traditional inner forestay on a roller furler. So yeah, it made sense.
Yeah. So now you mentioned that you hired a rigger to come and sort of inspect your standing rigging, check all the wires and make sure everything's good. Did you also sort of go through all of your sails and have somebody look at them and say, yeah, these are okay, or no, you should get new ones, or touch them up, or whatever?
That's for sure. I didn't. So we hired a company a few years ago to make a custom cover for us for like a winter cover, because we were really sick of plastic, and it's not really good for the environment, and it's a pain in the neck. And every time the contractor would come and do it, he'd mess something up on the boat, right? So yeah, we hired a Faircloth, who's a pretty well-known company in Connecticut, to make a custom cover for us. And while I was chatting with the guy, I talked about that we're going to go across the Atlantic, and he asked about our sails, and I said, yeah, I think they're okay, but whatever. He's like, yeah, we do sail washing and inspection and touch up for you if you want, and they charge per pound. And so yeah, we dropped off our main and our Genoa, right, sir?
Mm-hmm.
And I think it was $500, and they washed them and inspected them. And then, a few places where they saw some stitching need to get replaced, they did that. They didn't do any major upgrades, but, we got our sails back. First of all, they smell great and they look great. I don't know if you ever had your sails washed, but it's like, it's a nice, a nice little perk. And, yeah, we had the sort of sense that, okay, these two sails are pretty good. They're going to serve us for our next trip. Like, we've got that kind of box checked. So, yeah, if you're thinking about like upgrading your sails, or I'm not sure how many years do I have left in my sails, I would recommend, if you haven't done it before, get someone to like wash, clean, and touch them up. It's not that much money. And then you'll probably know you got 2 more years out of it, or you should probably make this fix on your sail to get an extra year out of it or whatnot.
Yeah.
Yes, we did that with our mainsail and our Genoa, and then with our inner forestay, or like our Sol and stay, we wanted to buy a working head sail, 90% with a hank on, sail, and then also a storm jib that we could hank on, because it's sort of talked about think about it, right? You got this like roller furler jib. You can't take that. It's hard enough to take it down and put it back up at the beginning of the season, right? When you're in the marina,
Right.
Like you're sitting in your slip. I don't know about you, but like you're sitting in your slip, right? And you're waiting, and it's like 5 knots. You're like, oh, and you gotta wait for it to get 2 knots, and quick, and it's a pain. It's a couple people. So if you're out and the conditions are getting bad, and you decide, okay, now it's time to have a storm jib, that means in those conditions you got to lower your jib off of your furler, store it somehow, have it not fall over the boat and get wrapped up and everything else, and then put up your storm jib. That's never going to happen. Never going to happen. So they do make ones that kind of wrap around your furled up jib, but that's also not easy, and we couldn't imagine that happening. So the main motivator for us to have this inner forestay was just another way to pretty easily have something to fly a storm jib if we need to, or just another good head sail. And we had, again, we were thinking about redundancy in our case, right? More than like performance. And there are some performance benefits to having, a sail that's moved back a little bit. But we thought, okay, we want another way to have a head sail if our like furler breaks. Imagine that happened. Sure enough, it happened. We did get it fixed, but when my dad and Sawyer and I got to the Azores on our first stop, and we get to the wall, the Azores, right? It's kind of cool. There's a volcano, all the boats. Get to the wall, you look out. I'm not exaggerating. If you saw a person, they were on the dock fixing their furler. Like every single person had a broken furler, right, Sawyer?
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And I really had not, like, of all the things that I thought could break or could be an issue on our trip, the roller furler was not high on my list. It's one of those things that you read about in books from the 1980s, like, should you get a roller furler or not? And it's often, about the reliability of the roller furler. But it's a really simple thing, and it had never caused us issues in the 5 years prior. And then lo and behold, with this stress of an ocean passage, ours broke, and we were able to fix it because it was a pretty minor issue. And then we get to the Azores, and I mean, they've got roller furlers out on the concrete. People are, they've got temporary forestays set up. It's a whole mess.
Yeah.
So in hindsight, like having that second forestay with this whole second set of sails was probably the best thing we did from a redundancy perspective.
For sure. Yeah, you really want a good way to throwing a head sail. And I mean, we also thought, remember, Sawyer, at some point, like, okay, well, there are all the like risks and okay, if we lose our head sail because the roller furler breaks or something, right? Well, maybe it's not a big deal. We'll just sail with our main, right? We'll limp. It's not a race. We'll just limp across, and maybe we'll, But I'll say this, from our experience, it kind of is a race in the sense that, and I know there's like YouTube channels where people are taking like 5 months to sail around the Pacific, right? But it's a race in the sense that you're always trying to race to get like away from the bad weather that's coming, or we're trying to race to avoid getting stuck in this really calm weather, or we're trying to get somewhere we're not all the time, right? And when you're sailing in a passage, the longer you're out there, of course, the more likely something bad's going to happen. Someone's going to break, someone's going to get sick, whatever. So you do want to kind of get from A to B as quickly and safely as you can. And so there is some real value in like, being able to do that and not tack on an extra week. And so, yeah, that redundancy from the Sol and Stay, I think, is really important for us.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Excellent. Hey, so we've been chatting 45 minutes plus here. So I want to start wrapping this up. What other sort of things have we not talked about that you'd like to share?
The only thing about saying about sales is, we talked about all the things we did not to buy sales, and we did buy some sales, right? So we did buy this the stay sail and the storm jib. When you start the process, it's a little bit maybe kind of overwhelming because there's so many options and what do you want to get, and there's different materials and weights of materials and whatnot. We found that going to your like forum for the owners of the boat that you have is super useful, right? So in our case, we have a passport. There's 148 ever made, and there's a pretty good user group. And you start talking to them, and they know what works and what doesn't. And then there's manufacturers of sails that already have plans for a Passport 40, and they already know the dimensions. And it's not quite off the shelf, but it's almost off the shelf. And then the question is, do you want kind of the lightweight version or the really robust version? And then there's, of course, the whole racing, which is kind of separate. No one's really racing the Passport 40. So even though there's a lot of options, we actually found that you can kind of drill down pretty quickly and get that figured out. So in our case, we bought an off-the-shelf storm jib because you're only using a fraction of that triangle, right? So you don't have to get precise measurement. So off-the-shelf storm jib in orange, 10 ounce, whatever the regulations were for like a Bermuda or Newport to Bermuda race. And then for the stay sail, we had to make some measurements, but we actually get our rigger helped us with that a little bit to get the right measurements and get to the loft so they could make a sail. So
Nice.
wasn't as hard as I thought it would be, actually.
Very good. Anything else?
No, I guess the only thing that comes to my mind really quick is, in terms of, I think folks often think a lot about storm sails, and we didn't use them. Maybe thankfully, we don't know many people who have had to use them. But we were fully on the storm jib train, and we, were not interested and didn't really consider having a tri-sail, which is the storm jib equivalent for a main. And that's just reflective of how we sail our boat. We find that it sails really well under just a head sail. And that's
Right.
That's how we have it set up. But your mileage may vary. So if you think your boat works better with a tri-sail, then it is a bit of a different process, a different workflow than putting in like a forestay.
Yeah, very nice. All right. Hey, so let's wrap this up. Hey, Sawyer and Simon, this was great. A lot of great information here that you've shared with our listeners. I really appreciate you being on the podcast again.
Cool.
Absolutely. Thank you, Bela.
Bela, this really was indeed an interesting discussion. And as you kind of promised, even for me, who doesn't know a lot about sailing, I learned a lot. Some of it was a bit above my level of understandings, but maybe give me your main takeaways from your conversation.
Sure. So from my perspective, this is not something I think about often because I'm basically a day sailor and a coastal cruiser I might go on a 3 or 4 day trip, but I'm not sailing 24/7. So those things that they did are extremely important if you're going on longer passages. And when you can't be selective about your weather, right? If you're going on a week-long sail, you know what the weather is for the next day or two, but after that, you're rolling the dice. And, on a long passage, a slight shift in the heading that if you can go, 5 degrees, a little more towards the direction you want to go in, because remember our sailboat, you can't always go in the direction that you want to go in, can make a huge difference in how you get there. Or a 1 knot increase in speed. And you think about it, a 1 knot increase in speed on a 20-day passage when you're sailing 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, can reduce that passage by a day or two. So it's really can make a significant impact. There are a couple of other things I'll say. So it's not something I think about often, but I will say even that sailing around the bay and going on a day or two cruise, there are times where I wish I had a preventer. Now the preventer is something that prevents your mainsail, that's the big sail, the one that has the boom on it, from flopping over from one side to the other side. So when you're sailing downwind, your mainsail is out to one side of the boat and the wind is pushing you from the back. So the wind is on the back, pushing you from the back, and your sail is out to the side. So the wind can push it. And if you're not careful, not paying attention, or the ocean is really rolly, what can happen is the wind can get on the other side of that sail. So it gets not to the side that you want it on, but it gets to the other side of it. And it then takes that sail and boom and slams it really fast over to the other side of the boat because there's nothing holding it from coming back towards the center of the boat and then to the other side of the boat. So a preventer is something that helps prevent that, right? It holds it in both directions. So the sail can't go and slam across to the other side of the boat. And that's called an accidental jibe. And accidental jibes are dangerous. They're dangerous for people because you can get hit by the boom. And there's been people who've been killed when that boom comes flying, and it comes flying across. And also can break a lot of equipment because you're putting huge shock loads on things. So that is something that I've thought about. And that's nice. That's particularly an important safety thing. It really doesn't make much of a difference on how you sail, but it's a safety thing, I would say the most. And, I like to focus on safety as opposed to speed, because oftentimes I'm just sailing myself, or I'm the person who knows how to sail on the boat. So I got to think about things that make the passage safe for me. And what I do is, again, I'm not trying to get any place, right? I'm just kind of sailing around the bay, or if I do have a destination, I've left plenty of time. And if it gets too windy, or or the wind changes and I can't go in a direction that I want to go sailing, then I just roll up my sails and I turn on the motor. Right? I mean, and maybe, that's not being a purist, but it's sort of being practical from my perspective. So that's what I do. And like I said, I'm sailing for several hours a day. I'm not sailing 24/7 for weeks, and I can't turn on my motor because I have to conserve fuel, etc. So I have a lot more flexibility. I don't think a lot about those things often, but what we talked about were all really important things and should be things that people understand and are aware of, so that if they are going to do some of these things, they can investigate them further and, add them to their boat if they so desire.
Interesting. And maybe this is kind of a dumb question, but in your life, the evolution that you had kind of from buying your first boat to kind of having these highly technical conversations about sales and, these small differences that technology makes, how long does it take, how long did it take you, let's say, to accumulate all of this knowledge? And how important is it to sailors who own their own boats to really be doing this kind of deep dive into sails?
That's an interesting question, Mike. I think it sort of depends. If you're an occasional sailor and you sail a half a dozen to maybe a dozen times a season, and you have your boat maybe on a trailer, it'll take you years to figure this stuff out. But if you buy a boat and you live on it 24/7, you'll figure a lot of this stuff out in the first month or two. So, it sort of depends on your level of immersion. And I think it's part of it's kind of specified by need, right? I don't know a lot about anchoring because I don't anchor very much. Right? I don't go out and I don't drop. I mean, I go out for lunch and I drop the anchor at lunchtime or to go swimming or something, but I rarely anchor overnight. And because I haven't done it a lot, I'm a little anxious about it, which means if I'm anchored overnight, I don't sleep very well, which makes me not want to anchor out. So I either get a mooring buoy or I go to a marina. So you see the sort of jam you get yourself in, right? So I have a good anchor. I have 100 feet of anchor chain. I have 200 feet of anchor road, right? So, I mean, I have all the equipment, but still I have anchor anxiety when I'm anchoring overnight. So I don't do it very much. And I think that was one of the points Simon was making, right? If something's too hard to do or you're not comfortable with it, you're not going to do it, or you're going to delay doing it, which oftentimes delaying things doesn't make the situation any better. Oftentimes it makes it worse, right? I always think about that, about reefing my sails, right? When the wind is picking up, the sails on my boat are really easy to make smaller or to reef, to take the big sail and make it half as big. It's really easy to do that on my boat. So I do it right away. And, it's really pleasant and it doesn't feel like the wind is blowing really hard anymore. But if it's hard to do, let's see what the wind does. And then it turns out the wind gets even stronger and now it's even harder.
Yeah. Interesting.
Right? So I think the rate of learning it depends upon your immersion, because if you're living on your boat, you're immersed in it, you need to figure these things out because it's part of what you need to do every day.
Yeah, I like it. So, I mean, this is kind of a nice reminder of sailing that, everybody needs some basic knowledge. There's lots of ways to get this basic knowledge. It's accessible about sails, but you really can go deep in terms of time and money. And this depends on how deep your interest is, right? So it's going to be a fairly simple hobby. This is one of the neat things, you want to sunfish. We've talked about that on a few episodes, right? Or you can get really deep, like what Simon was talking about in terms of technology and the skills you have and the decision-making about kind of how to outfit your boat, all based on how you want to use it. So knowing what you want to do, and you've said this a bunch of times on this podcast, knowing well what you want to do with your boat drives not only the decision about what boat to get or whether or not to buy a boat. We've had that conversation, right? And then once you buy a boat, what kind of sail technologies do you want to use? So I think it's a nice way of looking at it. It's a continuum, right, in the sailing world.
Yep. Well said, Mike. Great summary. Well said. Time to wrap this one up.
Sure. I think it's that time again. So listeners, thanks for joining us for yet another episode. We hope you found the conversation interesting and thought-provoking. As always, if you have questions about what we've discussed, please feel free to get in touch with us. Our email is sailingtheeast. That's all one word at gmail.com.
And if you enjoyed the podcast, hit that follow button on your podcasting application. Help spread the word about the podcast. Give us a review. Those things all help other people find us. So until next time, we'll see you soon.
Great. And from over here in Münster, Germany, thanks for listening and see you next time.